We've got a guest on the line who's going to talk to us about Flyers hockey. His name is Dave Isaac. He is a writer for the Courier Post. He's the Flyers beat writer, and most importantly, he's a Temple grad. Dave, how are you today? And thank you for giving us a few minutes.
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Good to have you. Now, Flyers, they've been on a tear lately. They dropped one to the Penguins this past weekend, 4-1, in a relatively ugly game. I can't sugarcoat that. I'm sorry. I want to get your take. You're in the locker room after the game interviewing these guys. You know, this means a lot to the Flyers when they play the Pens. What was the mood? What was the feel in the locker room after?
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty typical of the loss. Nobody was really happy with the effort, especially against that team. I think the Flyers really just kind of came up with a dud on Saturday, and I think they were very much taken surprise at the way that the Pittsburgh Penguins suddenly were playing defense. You remember years past and the way that this rivalry has grown, especially with the playoff series several years ago. It's been kind of fire wagon hockey, a whole lot of offense and not a lot of defense. I think the Flyers were shocked that Mike Sullivan has started coaching this Pittsburgh team in a way that they were playing suffocating defense. That took them off guard, and they really didn't have anything going for them. Yeah,
it took them off guard. I agree, and that's something that, at least in the playoffs, the defense of the Pens has been a little shaky. Now, you know as well as anybody, hockey is a game of gelling. I think the Flyers did very well at the trade deadline this year, not moving a lot of guys, trying to keep the status quo, and they're continuing to trend upward just so slightly. Do you think that Voracek's presence after a slightly long absence potentially hindered the Flyers a little bit in terms of gelling that game?
In terms of him coming back?
Yeah, like in terms of chemistry. You think that was a detriment to the Flyers that night?
No, I don't think that had something to do with it. I think it was just an overall bad game that everybody kind of had at the wrong time. I also think, when you have a guy miss 3 weeks of action and throw him back into his first game, and especially a game that holds that much importance, it's really difficult to have him be at 100%. He certainly wasn't at 100%. He admitted that after the game, but he said that he thought that his hands were worse than his feet, and that's what the injury was his left foot. So I think he just needs a little bit more time. And if you have a guy like Jake Voracek, who was in the points lead conversation pretty much all season last year atop the NHL standings there, you don't keep him out. You bring him back as soon as you can, and the Flyers are just trying to get him back to game speed, and they're hoping that things will go back to what they hope normal was, which is the last couple of months that, like you said, they've been playing pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with 12 games to go, if you got a guy like Jake Voracek going, the sky is honestly the limit. He is so dynamic. On his best day, he can be the team's best player. Now, speaking of 100%, you mentioned Voracek is not 100%. The guy who is 100%, who may defy the odds and may very well be 110%, Shane Gostisbehere has just been an absolute monster this season. Many are saying that, don't give him not the MVP, the Calder Trophy, the Rookie of the Year award, because he hasn't played in enough games. Panarin on Chicago seems to have the points. He does have the point lead. He seems to have the nod right now. Keith Jones was on NBC Sports Network, and he literally said that he thinks Panarin has the nod at the current moment. Going forward, who do you think at season's end will receive the Calder Trophy?
Well, I think Panarin, I agree, has the edge right now. I mean, if Gostisbehere can put a streak together like he had there with that 15-gamer, that would probably change a lot of voters' minds. But I think it's apples and oranges to compare Panarin, a guy who has a little bit more experience than Gostisbehere, and who's also a forward, to a guy who's a defenseman. I mean, you saw Aaron Ekblad win it last year for the Florida Panthers. He was 7th among rookies in points. But he did everything for that Florida Panthers team, and that's what got him the Calder Trophy. So it'll be interesting to see if voters feel the same way about Gostisbehere. I mean, he's not necessarily put in the same situations that last year's Calder winner was, but he started to play much better defensively. He's obviously been a huge key cog to the Flyers' power play unit, and other teams are changing the way that they cover the Flyers' power play because of him. But if he can get some more points here in the next dozen games here, I think it'll change a lot of people's minds.
We're talking with Flyers beat writer Dave Isaac of the Courier Post. He's also a Temple grad. Dave, my co-host Joe has a couple questions for you, or a question for you on the goaltender situation.
Yeah, Dave, unfortunately, Michael Neuvirth did go down with a season-ending injury, so Steve Mason will be pushed back into the full-time starting goaltender role with Anthony Stolarz coming up to back him up, essentially. My question is, how much faith do you have in Stolarz to fill in for, kind of spot starter, type of duty, especially since he pretty much doesn't have any NHL experience?
Yeah, Joe, that's a question that the Flyers are kind of asking themselves right now. How much do you trust a guy that hasn't made his NHL debut yet? When you have 12 games left and 4 back-to-back situations, so 8 of the games are consecutive, I think he's bound to get at least one here. The Flyers end their season with 4 games in 5 days. It wouldn't surprise me if he got one of them there, but it probably depends on what has happened to that point. And if the Flyers have clinched with a couple games to go, then I think you'd definitely see him in there. I think the Flyers have to ride Steve Mason for now and see how close they can get, see what other teams do around them. If they get to a point where they're eliminated, obviously Stolarz will probably make his debut at some point there. If the Flyers clinch, I would expect him to make his debut at some point. But until one of those two things happens, I think this team rides Steve Mason.
Yeah, and you did just mention how congested the schedule is down the stretch. Just how big of an impact will that have on the Flyers' playoff chances? Just simple fatigue, having to play so many games in such little span of time.
Yeah, I think it certainly plays a factor, especially in those second nights. We'll see exactly what it means for the Flyers, but a lot of other teams are doing the same thing. Detroit actually ends their season with 3 consecutive back-to-backs, so there is somebody that actually has it worse than the Flyers. Up here in Brooklyn right now, they have to go back to Brooklyn on April 10th to end the season because of that snow-out game earlier this season. So that's what contributed to it. The schedule wasn't meant to be that tough, but it got a little tougher with that rescheduled game. So, everybody's kind of dealing with it to a certain extent, but it does look bad when you look at the Flyers' schedule and say, wow, that's a tough hill to climb.
Yeah, and once again, we're talking with Flyers Courier Post beat writer Dave Isaac right here on WHIP. As far as it goes with the schedule coming up, like you mentioned, 4 straight away games, and that's going to be really rough, obviously, for the Flyers, being right behind the Red Wings and the Islanders, only by 5 points to the Islanders and 3 points to the Red Wings. The Red Wings streak coming up is not easy as either, as you see the Lightning as well as the Pittsburgh Penguins on their radar. What do the Flyers have to do, obviously, not being the best road team on the face of the earth this year? What do you think that this Flyers team has to do other than score to beat some of these teams?
Yeah, I think they just need to have everybody kind of going. I mean, when they talk about it, and it sounds like cliche when they talk about 5-man units, but if you watch them go with the puck from their defensive end to the offensive end, they are going up in formation, and you see defensemen pinching, and you see how confident they are, and it's because somebody's back there to help them out and take their spot in the back as they rush up. I think if the Flyers can somehow get a couple of goals and get that confidence is so huge in sports. I think once they feel like they're in a place where they feel comfortable, they can take a little bit more risks, and when they take those risks and they don't work out, they can go back and try it again without worrying about, oh man, if this screws up, then it could snowball. The Flyers are in a real groove there in terms of confidence and in terms of the way they're playing. If they can get back to that and just make that Pittsburgh game look like a blip on the radar, then they could be dangerous once again.
And you mentioned the streak they're on, and obviously before this game they were 8-1-1, I believe, up until this game. And you look at that, and that's huge. One thing I was looking at, and of course I'm not the biggest hockey guy on the face of the earth, but I know when you're scoring 33 points in the last 34 games, that's a huge deal. So Brayden Schenn has had a heck of a streak coming up lately. So what do you think, do you think Brayden Schenn is a pivotal part of this team, and what can he do to help boost the morale of this whole entire team?
Yeah, I don't know the science behind contract years, but he's in a contract year, and it always seems like when a guy's having his biggest year is when he's on the verge of potentially getting paid. And that's the case for Schenn. He's a restricted free agent. He's absolutely a key part to the Flyers' future. They will find a way of signing him. It's tough to let somebody go when you have their rights and they're still a restricted free agent, but that's the case with Schenn, and he worked his way up from the 5th line all the way up to the 1st line, so he's been huge for the Flyers, and they're hoping that they can keep counting on him.
We're talking with Flyers beat writer for the Courier Post, Dave Isaac, talking some Brayden Schenn. Dave, I saw this team in the preseason just like yourself, and Brayden Schenn to me just really stuck out among the rest. As far as guys who was really taking a leap forward, he's only 24 years old. Did you see him as a key cog, as a guy that's real for years to come, as a guy who could truly contribute to the Flyers going forward?
Yeah, like I just said, I think he's a guy that they're going to lock up long term in the next couple of months here. They took care of Sean Courier last year and kind of waited to let him work for it, and he's certainly proved that he was capable of doing that. And when you look at the Flyers prospect pool, they don't have too many forwards. They have Travis Konechny and really not a whole lot of other guys that are ready. Schenn has some NHL experience, but he's still a pretty young guy, so he's absolutely going to be a key part of this team for years to come.
Now, speaking of other guys going forward, you mentioned Konechny. Which Flyers prospect, we're talking playoff push, of course, but just for the diehards out there, which Flyers prospect do you think is going to come up and make a somewhat of an immediate impact? Now, it's not fair to say as close to as Gostisbehere's, but in the same ballpark of Gostisbehere, if you will.
Yeah, I think Konechny will be here next year. I think he'll end up playing a decent role. Like you said, not probably as thrown to the wolves as Gostisbehere was, but I think he'll be here next year. I think that Ivan Provorov will be here as well on defense for the Flyers. We'll have a couple of young guys being infused into their roster, and that was what Ron Hextall's been talking about for several years, and I think next year is going to be a big step in that plan.
Yeah, Hextall has just done a fantastic job. We're wrapping things up here with Dave Isaac, Temple grad and Flyers beat writer for the Courier Post. Dave, as you know, everybody in Philadelphia wants to see the Penguins lose. There's no two ways about that. The Penguins have a pretty tough schedule coming up. They only have 10 games. They have Detroit, New York Rangers, Nashville, the Islanders, Washington, and the Flyers twice. Those are all very tough games. They also have 3 not as difficult games against New Jersey, Buffalo, and Ottawa. Now, I've seen the scenario potentially unfolding since January. The last game of the Penn season is against the Flyers, and it is in Philadelphia. What are the odds that the Penguins come to Philadelphia in a playoff atmosphere game with a 1-point lead over the Flyers, and the Flyers win that game and knock the Pens out of the playoffs, driving the Philadelphia sports landscape bonkers? What are the odds of that happening?
I think they're pretty slim. Pittsburgh is on a real tear here, and they've jumped out of the wild card spot and into the big boy race there in the Metropolitan Division. So they're not even they're not as much of a team, I would say, on the Flyers' radar anymore. They're looking at teams like the Islanders, who they played tonight, and the Detroit Red Wings as the teams that they need to jump over to get into the playoff race. Yeah, okay. Well, we can all dream. And you mentioned Detroit. The Pens have a pivotal tilt in Detroit on the 26th, 2 p.m. You gotta pay attention to that game, folks. Dave, I just want to thank you for a few minutes of your time. We really appreciate it. Yep, thanks for having me.